Go ahead and start. All right, the conscious youth, Robin Bongo, Jerry Small. When I met Walter Rodney in January 1968, he looked scarcely older than me. Peter Phillips, who had turned just 18 the month before, and Mike Paco Morgan and himself, both 19, had been prepared during the preceding months for Human Rights Year. We knew government would be cautious about confronting human rights, as they themselves had proposed such a year. Hugh Shearer, Prime Minister in 1968, had been sent as a youth envoy. Has been sent as a youth envoy in 1962 to the United Nations to make a proposal. Though still teenagers, we were instrumental in the group called African Youth Move. We established a publishing house and planned support for the liberation struggles in connections with the organizations of African unity. Our immediate task was to link the youth of Jamaica in taking the baton from the elders and their tired teammates. Phillips, Morgan, Garth White, and others told me of the return of the youth alumnus of the universities of West Indies who had gone to greater heights in Africa in the academic and in the liberation armies, dashika clad and with the heavy head of hair. Walter looked a typical young Jamaican Rastafarian of a cumbersome variety. Those without dreadlocks. He met my brothers while in England and on his way to Helsinki World Youth Festivals in 1962. By 1963, he was back in London to step over the hurdles leading to a PhD and finer tuning of his teaching skills. We soon began taking him on our rounds. He was at ease, not susceptible to pressures or bullying. Frequently, in the hard-boiling beat of street activity and stomping grounds, individuals and groups would seek to impose lifestyles, pecking orders, and initiation rights on newcomers. We, the members of the African Youth Move, were not into that, but unavoidably, many of our associates would flaunt that swagger. Walter, or Brother Wally, quote unquote, would just smile and decline a pipe draw here and there and a spliff everywhere without being overbearing, gently returning the reasoning conversation to a more sober trajectory. The oldest members of our circle was Raz Dizzy, one of the best-known Rastafarian poets, a firebrand at times. Among the other senior members were Brother Fonoso, who was about the same age as Raz Dizzy, and Singlejack, or Tekis, host of the Langston Road Gully venue, and later a pioneering Ras of revolutionary Barbados. But most like Rudy Ten, a footballer, swimmer, and technocrat, Frank Hasselin, a printer, a writer, and Princey Advil King, a poet and public health inspector, were working in their 20s, as opposed to younger students like Garth White and Homer Haran, and several others who were in their teens like John Trace Davis and Darrow Crosskills. We also got to know other youth on campus like Robert Lewis, Keith Noel, Arnold Bartran, and Clarence Curtin. There were many sisters too, both inside and outside the African Youth Move. There was Sandra, to be my wife, Sister Manny, Angela Cunningham, Vicky Voren, Selena Tapper, and Lucilia Edwards. Most of all were Most of all, there was Pat Rodney, a nurse and a wife of Walter, along with their toddler, Shaka, who was full of energy and amusement. From Trenchtown to Browntown, Walter maintained the contacts he made during his student days between 1960s and 63, and as we took him through city and island, he would often drop in on people whom he knew before. My home in Augusttown was one of the meeting places, as was Thunder Guns Yard, also in Augusttown. The camp of Lenny and Byron in Hemorrhage. 16-year-old Orlando Wong, Oka Oronora, was teaching schools in Dokren when Walter visited the inner city headquarters, garrison of Rosnelgas, Shalal, Daddy Bill, and the Dons of Dunkirk. Campertown schools of Wembley Club in East Kingston, where classes climaxed with lectures by Walter Rodney, becoming regular fixtures. The Sunday activities kicked off with football, while the House of Dread and some lesser light Bobby Righteous Hamilton included. The newspaper improved once the youth historian Rodney joined the editorial efforts. He urged me to publish my verses. I aimed for sound systems and had resisted the poetry circle audience of Uptown. Pat and Walter opened their home to social parties and editorial planning. Men and women from downtown first experienced the lawns and comforts of Kingston Golden Triangle at their Trafalgar Park home. Various academics got on working terms with counterparts from the School of Hard Knocks and the University of the Street through the hospitalities of Pat and the instrumentality of Walter. Breakdowns of uneasiness between islanders attended this couple from Guyana, a country on a continent. People like Maven Alenia and the mover behind the African Studies Association of the West Indies, ASAWI, became more effective and was one of the few lecturers who defended and supported the discomfiting activity of this dino of a Dr. Rodney. There was resentment against Rodney's activity and association with the street, which manifest in senior common room, intrigued on campus, and pro-government susu outside. Walter made quick trips abroad and in the midst of teaching, both on and off campus. We occasionally reminded him that the government would ban him sooner or later, a reality which he remained conscious. When the Maline opposition became the government in the 70s, they let him visit, but they never lifted the ban. In 1968, progressed the epidemic of strikes, the banning of militant books and music. Police brutality were leading to the crescendo. The news of the youth African doctor moved with the Rasta youth was in keeping with this rhythm. My then girlfriend, Sandra, was joined by Walter's wife and others in popularizing the Afro Miriam Makeba hairstyle. The news of the Montreal Black Writers Conference concluded with the Olympics in Mexico City, presented a big opportunity to draw attention to African diaspora networks. Walter and Robert Hill told us about the conference and were local organizers of participation. They visited centers, including my home, collecting the writings of the island. We handed over publishing pieces and new submissions to Black Man Speaks. I included letters to the editor of a poem of Rati Marley, who decamped from Trenchtown to 9 miles in St. Anne, farming with Bob 2 years after he returned from working in Detroit. Bobby Hill alerted me that my brother Richard, Walter's good friend, would be in Canada as representative of black people in the UK. On one conference proposal, for instance, debated the urgency of the return to the continent as opposed to prioritizing political consolidation of the Western Hemisphere. This was even more typical in light of the debate between the Black Panthers' approach and Stokely Carmichael's Pan-Africanist tactics. Stokely had recently bonded with Miriam Minkebe. We were conscious that Walter might not return. The authorities were jumpy about reports they were receiving from Augusttown, Mona camps, East and West Kingston, and other points around the island. Compass of this youth historian accustomed to Jamaica, helping various groups to conceptualize how captivity had developed, matured, transformed, and how it financed and mechanized the new economics that many had swallowed under the guise of nationhood and independence. The brothers left in early October, Heritage Month, but the activities continue, with some students beginning the school year, while others return to employment and self-employment, meeting in the evenings and nights, traveling the city and island as printed products left pressed. Because of fear of branding, printing equipment given to the university was neglected by the student guilds, and the stock of paper was exposed to the elements. We made use of them, and some of us learned to maintain the machinery and mastered offset lithographic printing. Two brothers, Pepito and Maki Gonzalez, the elder brothers of the artist of Christopher Gonzalez, were our printers. One Tuesday night in Augusttown, we were following the Olympics in Mexico City when Arnold Sacre Bartram, the union chairman of the student government, and Robert Lewis arrived. We were trying to listen to the record of Marcus Garvey's that our brother Eric Clement, historian, had received in the mail. It had cracked. Bartram and Lewis brought more disturbing information. Brother Wally had been refused re-entry into Jamaica. The news was stunning, but not unexpected. We sat for around half an hour, mulling over the obvious options, and then we left in cars, bicycles, and bikes, and joined the crowd in Mona. Students filling out of their dormitories and study rooms to the undercroft of the university for a mass meeting. Speakers including students leaders like Ralph Gonslaves, president of Student Guild, the academics sympathetic to the movement. A protest march was planned for daybreak. What ensued was solidarity between the conscious privileged and the poor among the young people of the Caribbean. It was a violation of academic freedom, a regional right which aroused the indignation of the student body and faculty. It was great education for all the resonated with the frustrations of the mass of the people since independence, from the Coral Gardens pushed against Rastafaria to the garrison terrorization of the population. The march led to months of protest, rebellion in many forms. The Olympic Black Power protest of Tommy Smith and John Carlos in Mexico City following their triumph in the 200 meters took place on October 6th, the same day as Rodney's protest. The usefulness of the university and the possibility unleashed by the academic training were impressed upon the needy elements of the population. The opposition party was forced to update itself within 4 months. Their new leader had resumed a black image and heart adopting Walter's bush jacket style. Rodney's history and record became familiar, celebrating the humiliated far and wide, especially his humility in relating to the man and woman in the street. He made a speech at a rally in Montreal in response to the banning of Jamaican's government as against popular reaction. We acquired a record of the speech, a dozen of copies played in venues and bases around the island. In addition, the transformation of the profile of the People's National Party over the next year and a half, other national and international results followed. Upon Walter's advice, a national newspaper was launched. While this paper named Mbengi, I can't say it, Abeng, did not last long. It blew a fanfare and dispersed seeds. Black man speaking continued, and its personal contributed to the Mbang and myriad other efforts, Bongo Man and Lij included. Walter Rodney, like other visionaries, was not paralyzed by fate nor by circumstances. Rodney was determined to unravel the contrivance. I don't know this word. Be right back. Contrivance? C-O. It's contrivance of history and clarify the technicalities of entrapment. In leading by example, he sometimes risked security. He knew that class could be dismantled, and he sensed that race could be consolidated, then transcended. Rodney had this sense from early in life and began equipped with the sense of time and timetable. He achieved much in his record run. Of course, none of this could have been attained without a team. Great leaders are always part of a squad. Okay, and that's the end of that one. Now we go to Austin Davis, The Groundings with My Brothers at 50. I first encountered The Groundings with My Brothers as a high school student in the late 1980s. A developing world books of crafts in Toronto. I was finding my way in the world, and reading Walter Rodney alongside Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, and C.R.L. James was a crucial part of my political and intellectual development. As a child of Jamaican parents and as someone who had been attuned to Jamaican politics at an early age, I was struck by Walter's acute analysis of Jamaican society. But the impact of The Groundings on me went even further, influencing my decisions to study in Montreal, the city where I had spent part of my childhood. The move was motivated by the discovery that 3 of the Groundings chapters were based on the speeches that Rodney delivered in Montreal during and just after the historical Congress of Black Writers, October 11th through the 14th, 1968. I wanted to discover why this city had been such an important site for Black radical politics, a phenomenon that I have never since explored. In 1968, Walter Rodney was an academic who, despite his youthful 26 years of age, had already established a name for himself in Tanzania, England, and Jamaica as a first-class historian. But it was politics that brought Rodney into Montreal. And his participation in the Congress of Black Writers was not only important for the event, but also marked a significant turning point in his political life when the coincidence of his participation in the Congress and his expulsion from Jamaica by the government of Hun Shearer thrust Rodney into an international stage. It is interesting to note here that it was Robert Hill who was better known to members of the Congress Organization Committee, and that Rodney was not listed as a speaker in the initial Congress program. According to Raymond Watts, who initiated the Congress of Black Writers, Rodney was added at the 11th hour, following a phone conversation between Montreal and Jamaica. But the Congress co-chair, a future Prime Minister of the Dominican, Rosie Douglas, had anticipated the importance of Rodney's contributions to the event in the McGill's Daily interview that was published on the eve of the Congress. First described Hill's relationship with Rastafarians in Jamaica. He then turned to the central role that Hill had played in organizing various events sponsored by the Caribbean Conference Committee in Canada, including a series of conferences in Montreal that had anticipated the Black Congress of Writers. He also described Hill as someone who was now back in Jamaica, engaging in an important study of the Garvey movement, and he mentioned a young historian who had traveled from Jamaica with Hill, referring to Rodney as being just, quote, as committed as Bobby. Douglas persistently argued that the participation of the duo in the Congress would be vital to the event, and that they might, in fact, be the surprise of the entire conference. He also accurately prophesied that the public would be hearing much more from the two in the months and years to come. In the leading up to the Congress, Hill and Rodney had collaborated in the grounding session of Jamaica, for which he has since become famous. And as I have mentioned, 3 of the book's chapters are based on presentations that Rodney delivered in Montreal in October 1968. Quote, Statements of Jamaican Situation, co-authored with Robert Hill, and quote, African History in the Service of Black Liberation, end quote, were delivered during the Congress of Black Writers, and quote, The Grounding With My Brothers was delivered after the Congress. Quote, Statements of the Jamaican Situation exposed the myth behind Jamaicans' multiracial motto. Quote, out of many, one people, end quote. The championing of, quote, epical march forward of the black humanity, end quote. For Rodney, the mood and movement of Jamaicans' black sufferers had typified in the spirit and examples of Rastafari, which rejected all the trappings of symbols of official Babylonian society. But it was also evident in the government's desperate attempts to maintain a facet of plurality in the face of adjacent poverty and social inequality that was exemplified in the oppression of Jamaicans sufferers. The band of Stokely Carmichael, James Foreman, and H. Rap Brown, rest in power, from entering the country. The proscription of literature by Carmichael, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad. State repression was used against the ruthless black poor majority, including attacks by black police officers who, as Rodney duly noted, employed in the name of order and security as much brutality as white officers in the U.S. But Rasta and the black consciousness that was in part inspired by U.S. black power meant the interest in things African and black, challenging the epistemological order. Even police brutality pointed the way forward for young black people who were increasingly, quote, becoming aware of the possibilities of unleashing armed struggle in their own interests, end quote. Despite being in late editions, Rodney played a pivotal part in the Congress of Black Writers, making timely interventions on the range of issues as well as introducing the, quote, Big Three, end quote, participants, James Forman, Harry Edwards, and finally, Stokely Carmichael, who was at the peak of his rhetorical and political prowess at a moment, and as a primary exponent of Black Power movement, was the most anticipated speaker of the entire Congress. And it was Rodney who had the last word at the Congress. He was closed, and when he closed the event by inviting delegates to a post-Congress caucus. When it was all over, the participants and via the media, members of the general public were very familiar with the name Walter Rodney. In, quote, African history in the service of Black liberation, end quote, that Rodney demonstrated the erudite command of history for which he would become renowned. The presentation also gave his audience a glimpse of his capacity to bring history to life by linking the past with the present, making the history plain. Rodney also voided what we might describe as the, quote, great kings and queens, end quote, syndrome, which measures a society's worth based on the existence of power of monarchies, the size of its army, its political structures, its literature, and so forth. Rodney rejected this conception of civilization, setting him at odds with Richard B. Moore during the Congress, in favor for more egalitarian concepts that reflect the ways in which people related with one another in a given society, the culture of hospitality, the principle of genotocracy, genotoric. I don't know if this is meaning, hold on, let me look at this one. Beep, beep. It's gerontocracy, governed by old people. Gerontocracy in the practice of law in Africa. But having presented his overview of African history to a primarily North American and Caribbean audience, Rodney suggested that apart from this cathartic value, African history was more relevant to the social development of Africa, and that it was instead the history of Black people in the New World, quote unquote, that would better serve as a tool for developing a, quote, revolutionary strategy for the Americas. This was perhaps his way of suggesting that as important as it was for us to acquire knowledge of our African past, not me, Black people, this was no substitute for being grounded in the more particular experiences of histories that have shaped us in the Americas. Quote, the Grounding With My Brothers, end quote, presentation was delivered following Rodney's expulsion from Jamaica by the government of Hugh Shearer. But, as Rodney argued, it was a mistake for the government to believe that it could somehow halt or stall the movement of Jamaican black masses against racialized class oppression, simply by banning him from the country, invoking a poem recited by Ted Jones at the Congress, quote, integrated inward, end quote, or what Jonas also called, quote, the nice man of color. They switched it up. They used the color and then, yeah. Rodney challenged the myth of multiracial integrated Jamaican society, and he once again recalled the spirit of Rastafari as a penultimate example of Black Jamaicans' rejection of the society that had derided, despised, and dismissed it. As Afro-Jamaicans look towards the African continent, Rodney also called upon Black academics and intellectuals to attack the distortion of white imperialism, white cultural imperialism, as he had attempted to do in his presentation on African history at the Congress, for intellectuals to to move beyond the myth of Jamaica as a multiracial society and to attach themselves to the struggle of the black minority. This is precisely what Rodney himself had done during the grounding session in Jamaica, sharing his experience and knowledge of history and society with Jamaicans, dispossessed in some of the most economically deprived neighborhoods in the country. These groundings contributed to the emergence of a black political consciousness in the country and highlighted the importance of black people speaking to each other without outside interference. Another point that he had highlighted during the Congress of Black Writers. Lastly, Rodney reiterated his respect for Rastafarians and their philosophy, recalling how they had taught him during his ongoing exchange with them in Jamaica, humility among other things. It was the class of sufferers whose potential was expressed in their artistic creativity, who held the key to the country's future. Given the events that surrounded Rodney's expulsion from Jamaica, it perhaps makes sense to understand Rodney's presentation in Montreal as part of an extended, interconnected discourse in which each presentation complemented the other. What is clear is that Rodney's presence and presentation in Montreal announced him as an important Pan-African political figure who was beginning to exercise his voice on the world stage. In England, Rodney had been an emerging young historian from Guyana who having completed his PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies. It's Asian and African Studies, but they use the O word. As quietly making academic waves with his writing on African history, including 2 important articles that were published in the Journal of African History in 1965 and 1967. Articles that can be understood as in dialogue with the work of Carl Polignac on money and the slave trade in West Africa. Like many Caribbean and Pan-African figures before him, he also delivered public talks in Hyde Park, and he was among the number of young West Indians who had participated in the study circles in London, in a London home of C.L.R. James and Salma James. But it was in Montreal that he came into contact with some of the key figures of Black Power movement in the United States with whom he later collaborated. Moreover, the combination of Rodney's stature among Jamaican sufferers, his presence at the Congress, and the international attention that his participation in the Congress was, and his subsequent expulsion from Jamaica received marked and beginning of the trajectory that would eventually lead him back via Montreal, Havana, and Dar es Salaam to Georgetown, Guyana, his first and final resting place. If the Congress of Black Writers represented the passing of the torch from the generations of C.L.L. James to Richard B. Moore to that of Carmichael, Hill, and Rodney, it was the latter who carried the Caribbean and Black radical traditions of the revolutionary intellectuals the furthest among his peers. Furthermore, the publication of the Groundings did not only mark a new point of departure for Rodney. This small book was since played a big part in grounding and lending directions to countless others, and with the republication, it will continue to do so for generations to come. Giving Walter Rodney's profound understanding of history, he would no doubt appreciate the dialectics that play in terms of the importance of this publication today. On the one hand, the book sheds light on the historical moment in which people thought and fought in order to remake the world. On the other hand, the present political predicament demands that the remaking of the world assume an even greater sense of urgency. As a revolutionary intellectual, Rodney had profound appreciation of the relations between popular education and politics. And at the time when politics ideas were increasingly becoming ensconced and often ossified in the academy. The Groundings With My Brothers reminds us that ideas are, or at least should be, a necessary part of public political domain, as well as especially so in times of dread. Let's see here. Okay, we don't have more to go. All right. I think this continue reverence of Walter Rodney's grounding. Vernier A. Shepard. Walter Rodney's Grounding With My Brothers remains a relevant... Wait, let me see this. Let me see this. Is this the last one? I think it's the last one. Nope. All right. We're getting there, everybody. Sorry, everybody. These are just people talking about Walter Rodney's and his contributions and stuff, but I think it's important. I don't know. I think it's important. I don't know. If people disagree, they can let me know. Like, they'll look back. Nope. All right. Wait, does that say Newsom 2028? Newsom 2020? Jesus Christ. Someone in here saying Newsom. All right, Walter Rodney's Grounding With My Brothers remains as relevant today as when it was first published. That is because the people of the Caribbean still have not fully embraced anti-colonial and pan-Africanist path, and that he considered vital to societies emerging out of colonialism. Therefore, his ideologies need to be polarized and disseminated. Jamaica, for example, appeared more like a neo-colony, a pro-colonial state. Only 27% of Jamaicans believed that the country would have been in a worse position if it had remained in a British colony. According to the 2017 Bill Johnson poll taken on the eve of the country's 55th independence anniversary. But then I remind myself that Pan-Africanists have always been in the minority in the Caribbean. That the regime that expelled Walter Rodney from Jamaica was a regime that brutalized Rastafari in 1963. The regime that was hostile to Pan-Africanism. The regime that Rodney described as, quote, hate white-hearted black politicians, end quote, who, quote, served the interests of a foreign, end quote. White capitalist systems, while at home, they uphold the social structures which ensures that black men resides at the bottom of their social ladder. The regime that considered African history potentially subversive. Today, I scan Jamaican society and ask myself, were Jamaicans more African-centered now than in 1968, when Hugh Shearer government expelled Rodney? Do we live in a far more egalitarian and just society, one that has incorporated the masses to whom Rodney reached out in 1968? Are our political leaders still, quote, white-hearted black people, end quote, serving the needs of external stakeholders? Have we taken steps to correct the physical and psychological rupture from Africa? Are we still confused about the identity hidden between multiracialism and the notion, quote, out of many one people, end quote, while promoting the interests of the minority over that of the majority? Does Jamaica now embrace African history widely? Is Rastafarian oppression now a thing of the past? Are activists from the halls of academia as rare as in Rodney's day? Before reflecting further on those questions, though, let us examine the context of why some support while others oppose the ideological orientations Walter Rodney tried to pass on others with his famous Groundings. Groundings is among the influential publication. It determines the ideological orientation of some of us in the Caribbean and the diaspora, taking its place alongside Rodney's own How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which explains how the negative consequences of colonialism in Africa sprang mainly from the fact that Africa lost its power. Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, Sierra L. James, The Black Jacobites, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and George Bedford's Persistent Poverty. The Groundings explain the history of conquest, colonizations, and decolonization, the factor that shaped the ideological foundations of post-colonial societies in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean, and the historical basis of the social-political landscape of the 1960s, which could not and would not accommodate a Walter Rodney. The Groundings made some of us public intellectuals. This is manifested in the ways in which more and more academics now mix scholarships with advocacies around issues of human rights and restorative justice. For Groundings is more than a booklet that reveals Rodney's intellectualism. Groundings is a reclamation of the methodology of consistentizing development of Walter Rodney's in the 1960s to provide critical social intervention among the population and somewhat disposed but knowledge-hungry urban dwellers. Rodney's aim was to render his intellectual skills available off campus to those who had no access to university, hence going to the public. Influenced by this public education strategy, the Institution of Gender and Development Studies, IGDS, patterned this with colleagues from the Institutes of Caribbean Studies at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies, UWI. It initiated its own Groundings projects in 2013. They conceived of this project as a way by which the university could, in their 21st century, capitalize on its location to provide a co-curricula framework for reasoning and self-development among the student population, with a focus only on Pan-African issues, but also in gender issues. In particular, there are those in the very UWI history department in which Rodney briefly taught, who refused to imprison themselves within the walls of academia, instead embracing public education as a public mission. Following Rodney and historians who came after him, some of us have shunned the path of the classical intellectual associated traditionally with the ivory towers and snobbishness. I can't say it. It's snobbishness. I can't say it. The share in views articulated, as well as Edward said, that, quote, the intellectual is an individual in society that confronts orthodoxies and dogma, who cannot be reduced simply to being a faceless professional, a competent member of a class going about his or her business, but an individual endowed with faculty for representing, embodying, articulating a message, a view, an attitude, a philosophy or opinion to, as well as for, a public, end quote. That the intellectual must hold to certain universal standards, a truth about human misery and oppression despite his or her national background or class affiliation. That sometimes the public intellectuals must be prepared to be in exile and marginal. And as Said puts it, quote, the challenge of intellectual life is to be found in dissent against the status quo, at a time when the struggle on behalf of the underrepresented and disadvantaged groups still seem so unfairly weighed against them. Rodney would also have been thrilled to know that in 2018, UWI's vice chancellor is someone who was deeply influenced by the content, intentions, philosophies, and methodologies of the Groundings. in rolling out the university's new strategic plan 2017 to 2020, shaped by the AAA version, which focused on alignment of industry and academia, expansion of access to tertiary education, and agility of global opportunities. His friends and colleagues, Vice Chancellor Beckles, was essentially rebranded and repositioned the universities intellectually and conceptually, both in region and across the world. To return to where I began, despite Rodney's influence of some academics and human rights defenders, more than 55 years after independence, Jamaica still reflects the legacy of the past. The island still retains the monarchical system of government. If polls are to be believed, the majority wants this to be so. Republicanism remains a pipe dream, and despite some small steps towards symbolic decolonizations, too many symbols of colonialism are still on the landscape. African history is taught at the universities of the West Indies, but hardly a secondary school system. Caribbean history is recognized as a legitimate subject, but is not yet mandatory. Maybe policymakers are afraid of the philosophy that history prepares us for activism, that history is a way of ordering knowledge which could become an active part of the consciousness of the uncertified rather than the uneducated mass of or ordinary people, and which could be used by all as an instrument of social change. However, while some regard history as a relevant subject, there is an opposite view, namely the history has an active culture, a political role because of its relationship to national and regional identity. While the revisionist work of Caribbean historians and would destabilize the myth of stereotypes that prevail about Africa and the Caribbean has not made it into many of the texts used to teach history. At least there is a debate over history, truth, and objectivity unleashed by postmodernism. There is a recognition that many history texts exist in a dialectical relationship with the social and historical context. The following questions are among the ones being posed by the postmodernists. Whose history gets told? In those names? In whose name? For what purpose? The obvious public arrogance on the issue of African civilization, slavery, British colonialism, and the historical basis of reparations is of grave concern to many. The current Prime Minister, the Honorable Andrew Holness, I am happy to say, has offered an apology for the atrocities of Corral Gardens on the behalf of the government, and is talking about compensation. But present-day Rastafari are confronted with the destruction of Leonard Howell's pinnacle, what Clinton Hutton refers to as a destruction of the intellectual faculties of Rastafarian, and the prospect of losing control of what is shaping up to be a lucrative, legitimate herb industry. While the global Rasta, Bob Marley, was venerated, ordinary Rastafarian are still degenerated, even as brand Jamaicans relies heavily on culture and levity of Rastafari. Jamaicans are still struggle with their African identity, and bleach is now on the way of coping with pigmentocracy. I can't say this word, everybody. I think it's dying. Bleaching. I can't say the name, so I'm going to show it. Yeah. Oh my gosh, not the music. That's what it's called. A social hierarchy in which skin color is primary basis for power, privilege, and social status. Thank you. It's called desmodification and classism. Ethnic minorities are privileged over the black majority, who have less and less stake in independent Jamaica. There is still no consensus around identity and national consciousness. Garveyism might be taught in schools, but the philosophies are not recognizable outside of the classroom. I could go on. Clearly, the Groundings is as relevant now as in 1968-69. Even in a country that today celebrates heritage and heroes during the very few weeks of the anniversary of Rodney's deportation. Some of those who have been elevated to the ranks of national heroes and heroines, and whose life and work we celebrate that week, were black people who brawled out for justice. Black power activists with the anti-imperial ideology, just like Rodney's. The Caribbean was the site of the formation of European ideas and modernity, and their construction of notions of hegemony. And all of us who live in Caribbean space have been deeply offended by the actualization of such notions of hegemony. Not all feel the need to preach against it constantly, but the growing support for the reparation movement, including reparations preached by Rastafari, and recent establishment of the Center of Reparations Research at the University of the West Indies, provide hope that at last the groundwork laid by Rodney's Groundings is bearing fruit. Based on the causal link between crimes of slavery and native G-side, the centuries of radical apartheid that followed emancipation, and the ongoing harm of an injury of the decadence seen everywhere in the Caribbean and its diaspora. Caribbean citizens believe that there is a reparation case to be answered by the relevant European countries whose colonial act underdeveloped and disfigured the region. The reparations demand is framed within the discourse of development based on the links between colonialism, development of Europe, and underdevelopment of the exploited South. And the right to development agenda is reinforced in the Program of Activities, POA, for the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, and in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, DDPA. Clause 158 of the DDPA recognizes that historical injustice have undeniably contributed to the poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, economic disparities, instability, and insecurity that affect many people in different parts of the world, in particular in the developing countries, and recognize, quote, the need to develop programs for the social and economic development of these societies and the diaspora within the framework of a new partnership based on the spirit of solidarity and mutual respect. The DDPA is correct. Poverty is a consequence of colonialism and has always been tied to its discriminatory practices and legacies. The consequences of this is that Caribbean governments that emerged from slavery and colonialism have inherited the massive crisis of community poverty and institutional unpreparedness for development. The pressures of development has driven governments to carry the burden of public employment and social policies designed to confront colonial legacies. As Amartya Sen argued in his 1999 book, Development as Freedom, Overcoming these socio-economic problems is the central part of the exercise of development and of the process of ensuring that freedom that will otherwise fall at the feet of underdevelopment. The DDPA and the POA for the decade have suggested solutions, but these solutions are rather vague and unbinding, and they are framed within the context of what Dave Martin terms lexical colonialism. What is lexical? Lexical. Let's find out what lexical is. Whitewashing? Yep. I got it. I was hoping to get this done. Lexical. Come on. Relating to words or vocabulary of a language. So like a lexicon. Ah! That makes more sense. Like a lexicon. Got it. Doo-doo. Come on. There we go. All right. Stop. There we go. That needs to go down. There we go. With insufficient emphasis placed on the recipient and not enough empowerment of the recipient to deal with the artifact being transferred, the post-independence demand for development with input from former colonial powers still continues, especially as nationalist leaders anxious to capitalize on the prostrate conditions of European nations after World War II. In Bruce Staley's words, never pressed for compensation. On the contrary, the new nations founded with much hope faced daunting economic challenges. Seeley quotes Ahmed and Waki, who note, quote, "These nations soon began to realize that political freedom cannot be construed as an end in itself, and that achieving it did not automatically ensure the social and economic well-being of their people." Sir Ellis Clark, who was the Trinidadian government's UN representative to the subcommittee of the Committee of Colonialism in 1964, had made this point in his statement. An administrating power is not entitled to extract for centuries all that can be got out of a colony, and when that has been done, to relieve itself of its obligations by a conferment of a formal but meaningless because it cannot possibly be supported political independence. Justice requires that reparations be made to the country that has suffered the ravages of colonialism before the country is expected to face up to the problems, the difficulties that will inevitably beset it upon independence. That's why we not only owe reparations here locally, but we owe reparations to the global south, to the places that we underdeveloped. Europeans' alternative strategies to grant the Overseas Development Aid, ODA, is not the answer. Rather, the solution lies in reparatory and decolonial justice. Reparations payments were allocated appropriately, with likely having economically positive and statistically significant impacts on the region's growth and development. However, despite requests for engagements with a view to a negotiated settlement of reconciliation, Western European powers have refused to engage in any meaningful dialogue on the issues of reparations. The demand, therefore, remains active. Different reparation activists are pursuing different strategies to press the demand. Regional governments have chosen to build their demands on the development package outlined by a 10-point action plan drafted by the ICOM, Caribbean Community Reparation Commissions, and accepted by all members heads of the government. The rationale of the plan is that the magnanimity, African Holocaust, and colonialism in the Caribbean severely impaired the region's development options. The question is whether the majority of the people of the Caribbean will rally behind this reparation movement that is gathering speed globally, based on their ideological orientations and their resistance to anti-colonialism. Regardless, the late Ambassador Dolly Thompson, that tireless reparation activist, said that activism around reparatory justice will continue because, quote, the debt has not been paid, the accounts have not been settled, end quote. Reparation is a right to redress and repair, not an act of begging. Perhaps Jose Marti summed it up best. Rights are not to be taken, not requested, seized, not begged for. Last one, everybody. Each are responsible to each other. Randall Robinson. In the fall of 1970s, I met Walter Rodney at the reception given by the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, in East Africa. By that time, Rodney was well known and highly respected in global circles, and the Groundings of My Brothers had been read internationally, literally, and more directly. He had taken an active responsibility in being his brother's keeper. Human beings have certain psychological needs that must be met in order for them to survive, for food, for water, food, sleep, and so on. Beyond these, however, a sense of general safety and security is a key to our emotional and psychological well-being, as are our bonds with family, friends, and community. Interwoven with all of this, of course, is also the need to feel that our lives matter, that we have the opportunity to develop and express those gifts that are at the core of each of us. Recognizing the multifaceted threats intrinsic to the challenge of human existence, human beings have long devoted themselves to ensuring that their energy, skills, and other resources are invested. 1. To insulate themselves from life's varied threats, and 2. To ensure that their families' need, as outlined above, are met. Throughout history, however, there has been another category: those who, while heeding this instinctual impulse to protect self and family, are not merely haunted by the hardships they see in their lives of others, but faithfully attempt to draw attention to those inequities, to stimulate public concerns over these societal failings, and to embark upon their own campaigns of interactions with and advocacy in support of marginalized members of their respective societies. Walter Rodney belongs to the second group, reflecting on his attempts to serve as a bridge between the University of the West Indies and the grassroots communities surrounding its Mona campus. Indeed, reflecting on his desire to have those who have been blessed by the chance of circumstance to be more respectful of those who were not. His widow, Patricia Rodney, writes, "One cannot measure the organic and intimately personal connection Walter had and felt with his brethren as he immersed himself in the historical context of their condition. He was profoundly changed by their struggles and considered their survival a daily accomplishment." Of these interactions, Rodney himself wrote, quote, "They lived and they were physically fit. They have the vitality of mind. They have tremendous sense of humor. They have depth. Who do they do that in the midst of the existing conditions? Pan-Africanist in thought, words, and deeds, and confined by the dictates of class-riven society." Rodney looked beyond the material cues associated with those with whom he interacted, to their essential humanity. In the process, he brought to life the Haitian proverb. I can't say the word because it's in different name. Tat mon e mon. Every human being is a human being. And without claiming to do so, he made manifest the Ubuntu philosophy underlying so many African cultures. The belief that we discover our true humanity not in the lives of isolation, but via our relations with other human beings. Fervent in this desire to see Africans throughout the diaspora solve the problems and seize the opportunities. They are equally ours. Walter Rodney argues Africans everywhere to acquire new skills, a call that is as important today as it was when issued half a century ago. Indeed, the case can be made that concomitant with the diaspora-wide quest for expanded academic and technical skills, there should be a renowned appreciation of the humanistic values and the underpinned traditional African and Afro-Caribbean societies and allowed them to cohere in the face of quite gruesome and well-documented external assaults. I had the good fortune of meeting Walter Rodney when we were both young men. He was at the time living in Tanzania, and I had moved there as a recent law school graduate to compare and contrast the country's traditional and colonial systems of jurisprudence. He was by that time already well known beyond the boundaries of Africa and the Caribbean as someone who had undertaken considerable research into various aspects of African history, and I was pleased to meet him. Abraham Maslow, who popularized the notion of man's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow originally concluded that self-actualization was a pinnacle of man's achievement. In his latter years, however, he modified this stance. He amused that it was not self-actualization was a pinnacle of man's achievement. In his later years, however, he modified this stance. He amused that it was not self-actualization in the narrow sense that gives life meaning. After all, other needs have been met, but rather the human beings only find truer actualization in giving themselves to some higher outside goal, in altruism or spirituality. The dominant themes of the Groundings With My Brothers are empathy, awareness, respect for self, respect for others, constructive action. If the theory is valid, as I think it is, we achieve transcendence through dedications to the purpose beyond ourselves, then Walter Rodney's instinctual beliefs that, quote, every human being is a human being, and the research writings and lectures he undertook as a result must be bestowed upon him a state of transcendence. In Groundings, we see one Caribbean national commitment attempts to rectify societal inequities that were centuries in the making. And the Groundings, we are reminded of the importance throughout the Caribbean of lifting as we climb. And that's the end. Thank God. That's the end. And we could go over the other book. Let's go over the other book. Let's see what it looks like. Let's see what the other book looks like.